distinguished guests, and valuable participants. Welcome to this special event organized concurrently with the NATO 2025 Leaders Summit by the Presidency, Directorate of Communication, the panel, Türkiye and NATO in the face of transforming security information-based challenges. You honor us with your presence. We are delighted to host you at this very special event. Today, we are here to create a platform where not just leaders' perspectives, but also those academics and intellectuals will be heard. The discussion aims to revisit NATO in light of current challenges and address a range of topics, including the fight against disinformation and the future of digital diplomacy, with active participation from Türkiye. The panel will discuss Türkiye's NATO perspective and expectations in light of current global developments, with an emphasis on NATO's security and defense policies, as well as the importance of alliance fostering solidarity and cooperation with member countries in face of diverse challenges. The world is waking up to a new geopolitical reality. Rising threats, complex crises, and cross-border security risks send a clear message. Security is no longer just a military issue. It's also economic, technological, and societal concern. Distinguished guests, before we begin, I would like to share a program schedule with you. Our panel will begin with a video presentation on the need to transform NATO's collective security architecture, as well as the support Türkiye provides to the alliance for the establishment of collective security through its strategic communication vision. In today's world, where information presents itself as an independent battlefield, disinformation and manipulation emerge as a new security threat for countries, and perception trumps reality. Following the video, our program will continue with a video message from the Head of Communications of Presidency of Republic of Türkiye, Fahrettin Altun, which lead us into the panel session. Let us now watch the thematic video produced by the Presidency's Directorate of Communications.
The third decade of the 21st century, an era where boundaries are challenged not by states, but by information. Security is no longer ensured solely by borders, weapons, or armies. Information itself has become a battleground today. Every word heard on screens, on social media, or in the streets is a test of security. Today, not only the truth, but also those who narrate it and how it is conveyed matters. This new reality is also putting collective solidarity mechanisms to the test more prominently each day. It is pushing NATO, the foremost organization of collective security, to transform its security architecture.
Hepimiz güvende olana kadar hiçbirimizin güvende olamayacağı gerçeğiyle bir kez daha yüzleşiyoruz. Bilhassa NATO'nun küresel sınamalar karşısında daha etkin inisiyatifler üstlenmesi gerekmektedir.
In confronting the threats and challenges of our time, strategic communication is no longer merely a tool for NATO. It is a central actor, a game changer at the very heart of ensuring security and maintaining stability. And Türkiye is not just NATO's second largest military power in this new security environment. Beyond its responsibilities in counterterrorism and NATO missions, it is a strong ally that adds value to the alliance's strategic communication vision and maintains a presence in areas such as crisis communication, public diplomacy, and the fight against disinformation. In NATO's strategic communication vision, foreign information manipulation and interference emerges as a next-generation security threat. In a world where geopolitical competition intensifies and information manipulation proliferates, societies are being divided by disinformation. Perceptions are being shaped and decision-making processes exploited. Türkiye, which plays an influential role in securing and facilitating the flow of accurate information, not only for its own public but also for allied nations, stands united with NATO in confronting all these threats. In this context, through the panel Transforming Security and Knowledge-Based Challenges, Türkiye and NATO, Türkiye is not simply accompanying the NATO summit process, it is demonstrating a strong commitment to the future of collective security within the framework of strategic communications and public diplomacy. From crisis communication to countering disinformation, from strategic concepts to legitimacy debates, numerous critical issues are being re-evaluated through the lens of Türkiye's field expertise. Türkiye is here to share with its allies its accumulated expertise in communications, strategic vision, and political will, and to develop a common perspective. Because we know that the true power lies with those who build trust and defend the truth. And we, as Türkiye, will continue to work alongside NATO, just as we did yesterday, to build and sustain this trust-based security environment grounded in truth for the future.
Krizlerin derinleştiği ve gerginliklerin arttığı bir dönemdeyiz. Adil bir barışın kaybedeninin olmayacağına inanıyoruz.
Distinguished guests, we will now watch the video message from the Presidency's Head of Communications, Professor Fahrettin Altun. Let us turn attention to the screen.
Saygıdeğer büyükelçiler, bilim dünyasının kıymetli temsilcileri, hanımefendiler, beyefendiler, sizleri en kalbi duygularımla, saygıyla, muhabbetle selamlıyorum. Lahey'de gerçekleştirilecek NATO zirvesi öncesi düzenlediğimiz dönüşüm, güvenlik ve bilgi temeli sınamalar karşısında Türkiye ve NATO panelimiz vesilesiyle sizlere hitap etmekten büyük bir memnuniyet duyuyorum. Değerli misafirler, NATO kurulduğu günden bu yana bölgesel ve küresel güvenliğin sağlanması noktasında en etkili güvenlik ittifakı ola gelmiştir. İttifak, Soğuk Savaş döneminde ve sonrasında her zaman değişen şartlara adapte olabilmiş, yıllar boyu sadece Avrupa Atlantik bölgesinde değil, küresel alanda da güvenlik ve istikrarın sağlanmasında önemli roller üstlenmiştir. Malumlarınız bugün küresel sistem kapsamlı bir değişim ve dönüşüm sürecinden geçmekte, birçok alanda ciddi kırılmalar yaşanmakta ve güç dengeleri değişmektedir. Güvenlik eksenindeki sınamalar çeşitlenmekte, bu sınamalara karşı geliştirilecek önlemler ise yalnızca askeri unsurlarla sınırlı kalmamaktadır. Bu değişimin bir göstergesi olarak NATO'nun stratejik iletişim yaklaşımında yabancı aktörlerce gerçekleştirilen bilgi manipülasyonu ve müdahalesi son yıllarda öne çıkan güvenlik tehditlerinden birisi olarak yer almıştır. Filhakika, geride bıraktığımız son 10 yılda teknoloji temelli hibrit tehditlerin, bilgi manipülasyonlarının ve dezenformasyonun son derece ciddi sınamalar olarak yükselişine şahitlik etmekteyiz. Küresel bir güvenlik sorunu haline gelen bu tehditlere karşı iletişim, medya ve teknoloji temelli yeni strateji ve politikaları devreye alma ihtiyacı her geçen gün artmaktadır. İttifakın söz konusu sınamalara karşı mücadele kapasitesinin geliştirilmesi de artık zorunlu ve kaçınılmaz hale gelmiştir. Dolayısıyla stratejik iletişim ve kamu diplomasisi müttefik ülkelerin güvenlik yaklaşımında giderek daha fazla öne çıkmaktadır. Söz konusu olanlar sadece etkili anlatıların inşası ve hakikatin hükümferma olması bakımından değil, NATO üyesi ülkeler arasındaki dayanışma ve işbirliğinin güçlendirilmesi açısından da büyük bir önem taşımaktadır. İttifakın geleceği bakımından stratejik iletişim ve kamu diplomasisinde ortak bakış açısının geliştirilmesi, kolektif güvenlik arayışımızın kritik bir unsurudur. Saygıdeğer misafirler, NATO misyon ve operasyonlarında en fazla görev alan ülkelerden birisi olarak Türkiye, geçtiğimiz yıllar boyunca gerek yakın coğrafyasında, gerekse küresel alanda barışın ve adaletin anahtarı olmuş, bu yönde yoğun diplomatik çabalar ortaya koymuştur. Türkiye son yıllarda yalnızca askeri anlamda değil, dezenformasyonla mücadele, stratejik iletişim ve kriz iletişimi gibi alanlardaki tecrübeyle de ön plana çıkmaktadır. Ülkemiz benimsediği şeffaf, hakikat odaklı ve proaktif iletişim yaklaşımıyla ulusal ve uluslararası düzeyde olduğu kadar ittifakın bu kapsamındaki çalışmalarına da önemli katkılar sağlamaktadır. Bilgiye dayalı tehditlerin arttığı bu dönemde biz müttefiklerimizle kolektif güvenliğimizi güçlendirecek daha etkin ve yenilikçi iletişim stratejilerini birlikte inşa edebileceğimize yürekten inanıyoruz. Türkiye olarak bu konuda da işbirliğine, karşılıklı tecrübe paylaşımına açığız. Ben bu düşüncelerle panelimizin NATO ve stratejik iletişimin geleceğini ışık tutacak önemli değerlendirmelere imkan sağlamasını, küresel barış ve istikrara katkı sunacak çıktılara vesile olmasını temenni ediyorum. Hepinizi saygıyla selamlıyorum. Kalın sağlıcakla.
Distinguished guests, now I would like to invite our esteemed moderators and panelists to the stage to conduct our panel session. Our moderator, a member of the Security and Foreign Policy Council of the Presidency of the Republic of Turkey, Professor Kılıç Buğra Kanat. Please welcome. Our panelists are Director of European Studies Research Center of Ankara Yıldırım Beyazıt University, Professor Giray Sadık. Member of Center for Parliamentary History of the Radboud University, Lorraine Krump. Faculty member at the Faculty of Law at Utrecht University, Nathan Meershoek. Faculty member of International Security Policies at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, Patrick Mello. I would like to thank our valuable panelists and distinguished guests for participating in our program. I wish you a productive and inspiring day. I will now give the floor to our moderator.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to our panelists. And this is the sixth time that I'm moderating a panel on the NATO summit time, and it was 2019 London summit of NATO. And each and every time for the last 6 years, every meeting we started to say that the world is going through one of the most critical periods in its history. And for the last 6 years, every year, we encounter different challenges, different questions, right? When 2019 London summit, the question was, after French president said NATO is brain dead, the most significant question was the relevance of NATO. And in the last 5 years, we have been asking different questions about the future of NATO, the new strategic vision of NATO, NATO's role in the war in Ukraine, NATO's role in the counter-terrorism efforts, NATO's role in the war in Gaza, NATO's role in different challenges, including artificial intelligence, etc. And when we are organizing this panel now, after 6 years, we are now facing a more uncertain future than ever. Now everybody agreed that it was a scholarly exercise to argue that we are going through a significant transformation in international relations. But now we have been seeing that that transformation is real, actually. It's not an intellectual exercise or scholarly topic. Everybody is witnessing day by day that some of the most significant pillars of this post-Second World War order is being transformed, being challenged. There are now different challengers, different topics, technology, China, Russia-Ukraine war, and while we are having this panel, we are having another conventional conflict, which we thought they were over, probably 15 years ago between Iran and Israel, which US involved last weekend. Today we will discuss those challenges, and one of the most significant of those challenges as well is about communication. Especially with the rise of social media and other channels of communication, we also started to see that misinformation, disinformation, and different kind of manipulations and fake news has become a significant national security threat. So today with our esteemed panelists, we will have approximately 90 minutes to discuss these issues. And I will try to be not as nosy as I'm usually is in intervening the panel or the presentations, but I will also ask some follow-up questions to our panelists. So we will start with Professor Giray Sadık, and we will get his opinion, his ideas about NATO's future and potential security challenges in this age of security transformation, or whatever you want to call it. Then the next three panelists, we will have PowerPoint presentations, and we will get their opinion about the future of NATO. Let's start with you.
Thank you, Chairman. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by thanking the organizers, above all with the team from Turkish Presidency of Communications, Oğuz Hocam, Erkam Hocam, and all the team for this timely and insightful event. To briefly introduce myself, I am Professor of International Relations at Ankara Yıldırım Beyazıt University and Department Chair and Director of European Studies Research Center. My research concentrates mainly on countering hybrid threats and strategic communication and NATO-related issues, which makes this meeting even more timely right before the following NATO summit in the next few days, where I am also invited to NATO Public Forum. So, on this backdrop, let me start with that talk, which I will concentrate on the role of foreign interference, manipulation, foreign information manipulation and interference. What is this? What is the threat? Setting the stage for NATO, and the role of Turkey, which is of growing importance in light of recent challenges, as our chair had in his initial remarks. So, the brief version, FIMI, Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference. What is this? Recently, I also edited a book on that, and one of the contributors defines this as such. Let me quote: foreign information manipulation and influence is a mostly non-illegal pattern of behavior that threatens or has the potential to negatively impact values, procedures, and political processes. Such activity is of manipulative character. So that is important, and this activity is confused with disinformation, commonly we hear, which is defined as the creation and presentation and dissemination of verifiably false or misleading information for the purposes of economic gain or intentionally deceiving the public. Both of those challenges are challenges for strategic communication and hybrid threats, which aim to undermine trust, legitimacy, and cohesion. So in light of that, strategic communication needs to be considered as integral part for NATO, not only as a mere talk or a public diplomacy issue, but integral part of our security strategies, which we may expect to be taken more seriously at the forthcoming NATO summit as well. So that issue becomes important for NATO as an institution, NATO allies such as Turkey, and NATO partners in Europe and all around the world. That is why to this NATO summit, some NATO partners are also invited. Coming to the role of Turkey is of growing ones, militarily the second largest army in NATO, after the United States. That makes it the largest in Europe. And in addition to that, Turkish capabilities in terms of crisis management and strategic communication are growing. Among those efforts, we should underline the Presidency of Communication, Turkish Presidency Directorate of Communications, Stratcom summits, strategic communication, which I had the privilege of participating in some of them with the experts and policymakers from all around the world. And this year, we are in the Netherlands. The next few days, there will be the NATO summit in The Hague. Next year, Turkey is on the schedule to host the NATO summit. So that is very important to keep in mind. So for all our guests here, we are this year in the Netherlands, next year in Turkey, inshallah. So that is very important. So the growing role of Turkey is likely to become ever more important. And the role of strategic communication for NATO and NATO allies and partners is likely to be of critical importance because allies ignore the role of strategic communication at their own risk. So what are those risks? Also, you may take this as 5 key expectations, takeaways from my talk for the forthcoming NATO summit. So, NATO allies overlook strategic communication at their own risk and potentially jeopardizing 1, alliance cohesion. Number 2, burden sharing. Number 3, innovation and technological race with China, AI. Number 4, resilience in the face of growing global challenges, such as Ukraine on the table, but also we see Gaza, Israel, Iran war. So challenges are only increasing and our capacities need to be matching with strategic communication and other related issues to face those challenges. And here in international relations, we have saying actions speak louder than words. Therefore, in our message, we need to be consistent. Our actions and speeches need to be consistent, but also we need some sort of constancy. So, to have that determination of effort. Therefore, whatever the result happens at NATO summit, at the end of the day, our actions will be more telling than what is written on the communique or papers. And finally, number 5, that will give us the hints about the NATO credibility, which is important for NATO as an organization, for NATO allies like Turkey, but also globally for NATO partners and other actors in the region to respect NATO and allies as an international organization and as a potential contributor to global peace and stability. So to this end, these meetings are very important. And what I value most in these meetings is that interaction with the chairman, panel, and the audience. That is why I kept my remarks brief. On that note, let me thank again and end my conversation. Welcome for your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Professor Sadık. And a question while listening your presentation. There was this term called hybrid warfare, which became a significant aspect of international security studies. And in practice, when we look at the war in Ukraine, we constantly mention the different ways of hybrid warfare. Can you contextualize your assessment about the security risk of communication issues with hybrid warfare?
Indeed, that is a very important question because strategic communication has become integral part of hybrid warfare in terms of offense and defense. So here...
what do you mean hybrid warfare for those who wants to get the context of hybrid warfare as well?
Thank you. Let me clarify. Briefly put, hybrid warfare is combination of different instruments, state and non-state, civilian and military, and cyber and physical, combined to create synergistic effects. Mm-hmm. So from that point of view, as you alluded, Ukraine is the classical example, but we may say that until 3 years before, it was the classical example. Now we are moving to hybrid plus, or a next level of warfare, which is important. And we see that, coming to your original question, strategic communication is important in peacetime, yes, but in wartime it becomes ever more important. Signaling those critical messages, therefore it needs to be part of NATO toolbox as well, integral part of NATO toolbox, to counter hybrid threats and to communicate that messages with words and actions to contribute for deterrence for the allies, but also reassuring peace and stability in the region.
Thank you very much, Professor Sadık. And floor is yours, Dr. Mevşek.
Yes, I...
Sure.
Will the PowerPoint be...
Yeah. PowerPoint ready? Gökhan.
Do you have something to...
I have one.
Erkan.
Forward, backwards. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you. First of all, my thanks as well to the organization of this event for the invitation. I'm especially honored as during my studies I had the pleasure of studying for a semester in Istanbul, so especially grateful to be here today. In my talk I will go with you through the EU's role and then particularly in the area of military industries, so the industrial aspects of defense, so to say, the relationship with NATO, collective defense, as well as with third countries in the sense outside of the European Union, but inside NATO, such as the United Kingdom and Turkey. So to start with, I think one of the most important topics of this NATO summit is going to be defense industries. So, of course, in the news, you probably all have read the idea of increasing defense budgets up to 3.5% of GDP, 5% if including dual-use investments, so to say. But the big question is, how are we going to spend this money? Of course, part of these investments are they will be invested in the salaries of the military personnel, but a large sum of the money needs to go into industrial capabilities, and a large part needs to go into industrial capabilities that we do not have at the present moment in Europe. So we need to scale up our industrial capabilities, and that is where the EU comes in. But to understand the role of the European Union in defense, it is necessary to go back to the roots of European integration, because historically the European Union has not been involved in defense. In fact, as you may know, the European Economic Community, the predecessor of the European Union, was founded by the Treaty of Rome in 1957 as an alternative to military integration in the European defense community. So the idea of a European defense community came about in the early 1950s and would have integrated the military forces of the 6 founding member states of the later on the European Economic Community, but eventually this plan was France failed to ratify the treaty that would have created this defense community, and NATO became in that way, especially after Germany's accession in 1955, the primary foundation for European security and for collective defense. And that means that the Treaty of Rome, creating the economic integration, as the name European Economic Community says, included a very straightforward and strong exception from EU law, so from the economic integration project for military industries. And we still have that exception today in the EU treaties, as you can see on the slide, Article 346 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Then, with the Treaty of Maastricht, the European Union was granted a competence in the field of defense, the common security and defense policy, including the progressive framing, so to say, of a common EU defense policy, and at some point perhaps a common defense. But unlike the economic integration process, this area of the European integration is based on intergovernmentalism, meaning that member states, all the member states, still have their sovereignty over military affairs, which was also reiterated by the Treaty of Lisbon in 2007. So that's in a nutshell the background of the EU's role in defense, or the lack thereof, if you will. So the common security and defense policy, which we so since the Treaty of Maastricht, we can see in the treaties specifically mentioned that not only is the idea of European defense based on the capabilities of the member states, so meaning that the EU does not have its own military capabilities, obviously, but also any EU action in the area of defense depends on the willingness, the political willingness of member states to contribute to European defense, and in practice that means through unanimous decision making. And what about NATO? Well, on top of that, we find some sort of mutual defense clause in the EU treaties, somewhat similar to Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, but with an important condition set to it that for NATO members, the North Atlantic Treaty remains the foundation of their collective defense. And of course, I do not have to tell you that there are certain European states within NATO that are not in the EU, as mentioned, Turkey and the United Kingdom especially, but there are also quite some EU member states that are not in NATO. You could think of Austria, Ireland, or Cyprus. So, in fact, we find that NATO collective or European EU-based collective defense is subordinated to NATO collective self-defense, at least in legal terms. Then, in practice, the war in Ukraine has shown the vulnerability of European security, in particular when it comes to industrial capabilities. So after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the European Peace Facility was for the first time used to supply arms to Ukraine based on collective financing within the European context. As there is a specific prohibition in the EU treaties from using the regular union budget for defense spending, this was financed through a separate financing mechanism, which also enabled so-proclaimed neutral states, as well as Hungary, which is not really a neutral state, but positions itself somewhat neutrally, perhaps not the right word, but in the Ukraine conflict. They could abstain from the instrument, meaning that they do not have to contribute financially to this supply of arms to Ukraine through the constructive abstention, meaning that there is unanimity, but certain member states chose to abstain from voting. But then the war in particular showed us the enormous dependency on the United States, the European dependency on the United States. What you see on the slide is the military support to Ukraine in euros, so the military support meaning the supply of arms to Ukraine. And we see, and of course this has changed recently, but we see that the United States by far outnumbers all EU member states as well as the United Kingdom. And of course everything supplied by the United States, these are all US manufactured arms. But it is even worse if we look at the numbers of US imports when it comes to the arms supply to Ukraine. Because in fact, 63% of all the EU supplies to Ukraine were sourced from the United States, meaning that we were sending US manufactured equipment, so equipment that is not manufactured in Europe and that we do not have ultimately the control over. So there is a huge dependency on the United States when it comes to military industries. Already in 2009, quite some time ago, the EU sought to decrease this dependency by adopting a directive, a regulation, to regulate the military procurement of the member states, aiming to foster the strategic autonomy of the European Union by imposing on member states, on the governments, to procure military equipment based on competitive tendering, meaning that governments are not allowed anymore, would not be allowed anymore to discriminate between national suppliers and foreign suppliers of, at least within the European Union, of military equipment. However, this directive included very wide exceptions, especially when it concerns the involvement of third countries, like the United States. You could think, for instance, of the F-35 program, which completely falls outside the scope of this regulation, but also R&D cooperation within Europe. Recently, the Commission has proposed some modernization of this instrument, but it doesn't really fundamentally change the nature of this directive, which seeks to basically integrate military industries within the broader framework of the internal market. But as you can imagine, this has failed. Because in reality, when states enter into military procurement, they are not so much driven by economic efficiency rationales, but they are first and foremost driven by the aim to increase their military power. In addition to that, as components of military power, I would say, states seek military independence by buying from national suppliers, from their own industries. As a country, when you buy from your own industries, you have ultimate control over the production capacities, and you have control over the exports of the products, and they seek military interdependence, for instance, within the framework of NATO or the EU. Then both in terms of military power in an absolute sense, military power in terms of independence and interdependence, we see a very strong tension between short-term needs, especially since 2022. We need to supply Ukraine with arms, basically with arms that we are not able to produce ourselves in Europe, and the long-term goal of strategic autonomy. In fact, the war in Ukraine has increased the role of the EU in defense, you could say, but not necessarily to the benefit of strategic autonomy, because the urgency means that we need ever more to rely on the United States. And then also in terms of balancing between military independence and interdependence, that is a balance between security of supply, and the larger the state, the larger the military of a state. Well, I heard that Turkey is has the largest army of Europe, so they have a lot of NATO army. They have a lot of capabilities, so to say. They have a lot of spending. They have a lot of possibilities to have their domestic industries, whereas smaller countries obviously do not have that, and they need to rely more on interdependence instead of independence. So when it comes to procurement, one of the conclusions of my research is that military procurement cannot effectively be integrated into an economic integration framework as the European Commission, the European Union sought to do, but instead should be based on military interdependence, meaning transnational specialization where possible. And that is also now, that will be in the coming years one of the big issues for EU defense industrial policy. So we've seen that based on the ineffectiveness of this procurement regulation, the European Commission in recent years has shifted its focus to direct directly subsidizing EU defense industries based on subsidies to governments, as well as subsidies, so national governments, as well as subsidies to defense companies. Even though, as I said before, there is a prohibition in the treaties to use the regular union budget for defense spending, most of these initiatives are actually based on the regular union budget, and meaning that all the 27 member states financially contribute to it, and that that also means that self-proclaimed neutral countries contribute to this as well. So here are the most important instruments the EU has adopted in recent years. Already before the 2022 invasion by Russia of Ukraine, the European Defence Fund was created based on the long-term strategic autonomy goal to subsidize R&D investments in the defense sector. And after the outbreak of war in 2022, the so-called EDIRPA and ASAP instruments, they were initiated to subsidize defense companies and governments for the short-term needs, especially in relation to the war in Ukraine. And this is supposed to be prolonged by the European Defence Investment Programme regulation, which still has to be adopted by the European Parliament and the Council. And they are currently the most difficult issue to resolve at the moment is the extent to which third country companies as well as governments would be able to be included in these subsidy schemes. So then the Rearm Europe plan, in March of this year, the European Commission presented this plan, including a 150 billion euros investment through loans that will be granted to the member states, but will be backed by the EU. So they will be backed by the union budget, which means that for a lot of the member states means that they can loan for a beneficial interest. And most interestingly is that the Rearm Europe plan, as presented in the white paper for European defense, includes the so-called 7 priority areas for which this funding should be used. And this is interesting because this is actually the first time that something like that has been adopted at the EU level. So meaning that these are the critical capabilities that we as the European Union member states should resolve in a European manner and not in a national manner. Of course, we have to see how effective that will be, but if Europe wants to decrease its reliability on the United States in industrial terms, then that would be very important. So this, and I almost come to the end of my presentation, but this 150 billion, not really a fund, but these loans which will be provided to the member states is interestingly both aimed at the short-term needs, which I mentioned before, as well as the long-term goal of strategic autonomy. But then inherently you have a tension when you have to implement these loans, when you have to grant these loans, because you cannot usually achieve both objectives at the same time. And still, for a lot of short-term needs, for urgent needs, supplies to Ukraine, refilling our own stocks, still US companies often offer a much quicker and better solution than European companies, while strategic autonomy demands Europe to invest in these European companies, in these European industries that are not able to supply in a very short time frame. So that's where I think third countries come in, and that's, I think, the most interesting part of this action is the question as to the extent to which third countries other than the United States, such as the United Kingdom and Turkey, will be included in this framework, because the regulation, which is based on, leaves the door open for that, but in order to, for Turkish companies, for instance, to be in the future be included in this funding, first the European Union and Turkey, they must sign a defense partnership agreement. But I think if, in order to decrease reliability on the United States, this will be a very important thing, which perhaps will also be discussed this week during the NATO summit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You can. Now there is this question, and we have been following for the last at least 2 years the discussions within the EU about strategic autonomy. And here is the critical question. The strategic autonomy debate is not a new debate. And it has been taught at least for the last 10, 15 years by the EU. Each and every time there is a divergence of interest between EU and United States, there is this discussion of strategic autonomy and EU-based foreign policy. How do you think, when you look at that trajectory and having the difficulty of having a common foreign security policy, do you think EU can achieve those goals? Number one question. Number two, how feasible are they? Number two, when we look at those 7 critical areas that you just mentioned, we have to also understand that defense industry, especially in the context of this increasing conflicts around the world, become a moving target. Drones was one of the most significant game changers in Ukraine. And now in Iran, we are discussing ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles. And on top of that, last weekend, everybody was talking about B-2 bombers and MOB and all of those bunker busters. So each and every conflict is bringing a new set of instruments, which makes that 7 critical areas very difficult to achieve and need to have the flexibility to add more issues on top of that. Do you think EU, with its current structure and current form of decision making, which in some areas very difficult to achieve, and its heavily regulative framework, do you think it can achieve those goals?
Yes, thank you. So first, the question of strategic autonomy, I completely agree. As I showed as well already in 2009, this was on the table. Basically, since the end of the Cold War, as the European Union is struggling with how to position itself geopolitically more independent from the United States. Of course, nowadays with a much stronger geopolitical pressure. And in reality, the situation is problematic, I'd say, because there are very different, even within the European Union, but also within Europe, there are very different perceptions of what European security is. As I showed, that there are states within the European Union that have not been part of the support to Ukraine, such as the neutral states, Austria, Ireland, but also Hungary.
You don't want to say neutral to Hungary multiple times today.
Yeah.
Maybe active neutrality.
Yeah, I have to think of the right term for that. Yes, it's a NATO member, but in terms of all, it has frustrated basically all EU endeavors to support Ukraine and to punish Russia. So there is a big problem there. But of course, Hungary is not, in military terms, not that significant a state. But I think the most pressing issue is that there are diverging ideas of what European security is, and where we have, especially in the East and in the Baltics, and also in Scandinavia, states that feel a very, very high geopolitical pressure from the Russian threat, and there are states that do not feel that pressure. They perhaps participate in these initiatives I mentioned, but then the question is, okay, if EU funding is going to support the industrial development in these states, will that actually be to the benefit of European security if it comes to it? That's a big question mark. So I think that's the main issue. And then if you take a country as Poland and the Baltics, they are still now, I think, much more ready to rely still on the United States within a NATO framework, of course, than on European partners. So I completely agree that this is going to be very difficult, and it requires a lot of flexibility, as at no point all the 27 member states will be on the same page here. And then
Critical industries, the critical areas.
Yes, the critical. Yes, no, I also agree, of course, that you need flexibility there, but I think it's quite a big step now that we say that we point to certain areas and we say we need European solutions here instead of every member state for itself, putting it a little bit extreme. So I think that is quite a big step, but that, of course, it doesn't mean that these are the only important areas. It only means that in these areas there is a role for the EU. In all the other areas, there's still a role for the member states themselves, but also in partnership with other third countries. So when you take drones, for instance, then of course, obviously, the partnership with Ukraine is very important to learn from what they have experienced on the battlefield, also in our technological innovation processes.
One thing in the critical industries, I didn't see any air defense systems. So the reliance on NATO structure will continue for the EU in that area?
I think I do think it falls in one of the categories. So it is part of this. It is mentioned in this security action for Europe. But the extent to which, for the short term, yeah, we definitely have to rely on an American partnership because it takes a long time to develop such systems. So I think they still try to balance here between what I refer to as the short-term needs and the long-term strategic autonomy objective.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mershek. Now the floor is yours, Dr. Kramp.
Thank you. I will also walk over there because of my PowerPoint. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon also to the chair and the fellow panelists and to everyone from the Turkish embassy in the Netherlands. It's a great honor to be invited to this panel also by a country that is so crucially important to NATO in geostrategic terms. So it's my great pleasure to be here. Today I am going to talk about European security architecture, past lessons, current threats, and future opportunities. And I will do so as an international historian, so I will also take you back a little bit in history, who's mainly interested in pan-European diplomacy in the late Cold War and afterwards. So apart from NATO, I will also be mentioning not only the EU, but also the OSCE and the UN. And obviously 20 minutes is far too short to do justice to such complex issues, but I hope it will give rise to further discussion. So, as to past lessons, I would like to share a few ideas with you which I base on a think tank of the Organizations for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, which I joined in the wake of the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. And there were several track 2 initiatives between 2014 and in fact the present day, but the ones I joined took place in 2017 and 2018, so before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in order to see how we could learn from the past in order to give shape to the future and diffuse international tensions. And I participated in an oral history workshop also with a lot of NATO ambassadors there called The Road to the Charter of Paris, Historical Narratives and Lessons for the OSCE Today. And I think a lot of the lessons we drew could also be lessons for NATO, which looked at the late Cold War and mainly at the period between the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the reunification of Germany in October 1990 and the opportunities that were perhaps missed. And I think a few lessons that we could draw and that we could also apply to NATO and that we could learn together is to be sensitive to the past and to the future. That sounds perhaps like a no-brainer, but what I mean here, for example, in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of talk of whether it's a myth or not that there were promises made to Russia in the wake of basically the end of the Cold War about NATO not expanding eastwards. Well, legally there were no promises made in the sense that no treaties were signed that NATO would not expand eastwards. But in terms of sort of mutual trust, there were conversations, for example, between the then Soviet leader Gorbachev and the American Secretary of State Jim Baker, in which orally it was said that NATO would not expand eastwards. And the reason I'm mentioning that is that one of the other lessons that we could draw from that post-Cold War period, which was a sort of acceleration of history, so that year I mentioned, 1989, 1990, where a lot of decisions had to be made very swiftly, very, in a way, similar to the period we find ourselves in today, but from a different perspective. At that stage, we had this sort of post-Cold War triumphalism, especially from a Western perspective, thinking the West won the Cold War. And at the moment, we also have to sort of reshape European security under a lot of pressure, but on a different pressure. How are we going to face the Russian threat? But the point I want to make about not leaving unfinished business and being sensitive to the past and the future is that what struck me from a lot of diplomats that I talked to in that oral history workshop, who were diplomats in the late Cold War, from all over Europe, including Turkey, but also Russia, and so on, the United States, European Union member states, is that they said we were forced to make a lot of decisions under pressure when a lot of things were coinciding, which from a historian's perspective are often studied independently. So today we realize, I think, that the war in Ukraine, the crisis, which by many experts has not by now been called genocide, and I think you can call it that, in Gaza, but also the current developments in Iran interrelate. Often, in another 20 or 30 years, these may be studied as separate issues, whereas we should see them together, and I'm going to briefly touch on those today as well. And the unfinished business, some of the unfinished business that was left after the Cold War in this sort of triumphalist era of the West winning the Cold War in the terms of President Bush Sr. was how are we going to give shape to the European security architecture and what are we going to do with Russia? Because what in fact happened, as we all know, NATO expanded eastwards, the EU also welcomed a lot of former Warsaw Pact countries, but there was no long-term solution to a new equilibrium, in a way, if you see what I mean. And what I liked about this oral history workshop is that we didn't talk about broken promises, which is often the words you hear about those promises or not on NATO expansion, but about a broken spirit of cooperation. Nor did we talk about the new Cold War, which is a term that is often used, especially since Russia's annexation of Crimea. But we talked about an unfinished post-Cold War settlement, which I think to describe today's sort of crisis in European security is a much more fruitful term. There is no new Cold War in my mind, in the sense that we don't have two power blocks competing or two ideologies competing, but there is an unfinished post-Cold War settlement that we're still trying to work our ways out of. I think another very important lesson is to avoid triumphalism. At the end of the Cold War, George Bush Sr., I just mentioned him, the then American president, said, you know, we won the Cold War and they didn't. To hell with the Soviets, they cannot clutch victory from the jaws of defeat. Well, in the short term, that may have been true, but in the long term, that of course left Russia sort of searching for an answer to that kind of rhetoric and for finding a new place in Europe. And also expectation management. Like I said, legally nothing was promised to Russia, but there were expectations that you could say were broken. The other thing I think we have to bear in mind when we talk about NATO, but also about the EU, the OSCE, the UN, and other international organizations, is alliances versus security architecture. And I think what's very important for NATO as an alliance is also to think, and I think Turkey has a very important role in that, about the future of the security architecture and not just of NATO as an alliance. So I think these are a few things that we now, when we find ourselves in such an acceleration of history again, especially with Trump now in his second term as American president, where often more things seem to happen in geopolitical terms in a week than sort of used to happen in a year, although I do take your point that, you know, every time you convene these kind of things, you think that crisis is at its height. But I do think we live at a very unique moment in history where the future of NATO and the role of its allies is incredibly important, and where I think what I already mentioned, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, Turkey has a very crucial role. So these are a few past lessons that we should think about as this historical juncture. And there's one thing I quickly want to look at with you, and this is a quote in the discussion in the British Parliament on NATO expansion in 1997. So this was the expansion with former, or the discussion on the expansion with former Warsaw Pact countries, such as Poland, where not only in the British Parliament, also in the Dutch Parliament, in many other parliaments, also in Turkey, there were a lot of discussions. Is this a good idea to expand NATO? Is it going to increase our security, or is it going to increase antagonism? And Bill Walker, a Conservative Member of Parliament, had requested a debate on it, and he said, and I'm particularly interested in the last few lines, but I will read the whole quote. Does anyone seriously believe that a defense alliance around the perimeter of Russia from the Balkans to Moldova and the Ukraine will not have an impact in Moscow? I judge that it could create an atmosphere from which extreme politicians might emerge as the next leaders of Russia. I accept that Russia poses no threat at present, but I remind the House that no one had heard of Hitler in 1930. History tells us that the actions of today sow the seeds of the harvest that we shall reap in the next 10 to 15 years. I think this last line is something that we should particularly in mind with decisions that are being made today and that will be made also perhaps in the next few days, in the next few weeks, is to not only look at the short term but also at the long term. And in the case of Ukraine, and I think obviously with the NATO summit starting tomorrow, everyone is thinking about Ukraine also. I by no means want to justify Russia's invasion, which of course was illegal in every possible term, but I do think what we see here in terms of contextualizing it, it's not saying that the expansion of NATO would cause Russian aggression, but it is saying that the expansion of NATO could create an atmosphere from which extreme politicians might emerge as the leaders as the next leaders of Russia. And I think that's something that's interesting to bear in mind also in terms of the present. Now, if we move on to the present, I've been talking about Russia and Ukraine, but of course we cannot keep the Middle East out of the current threats. And I think there are quite a lot of current threats, and it's very important not to point at the other, but also to look critically at ourselves, and I also say this to myself from the Dutch perspective, because one of the threats is, of course, populism, in the sense that a lot of populist parties, also in the Netherlands, have at most a very ambivalent attitude to international organizations such as NATO, and at worst a very negative one. Also, the fact that we've got an American president that is who is becoming increasingly authoritarian and who seems to have, either no strategy or a strategy that's very difficult to predict, if I may say so, and who keeps surprising his allies in NATO, revanchism. We've seen that from Russia, of course, but more important, if we keep the Ukraine issue aside, because we shouldn't just focus on that, is the breakdown of the post-World War II orders, and I think the double standards that we've seen since the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. And I think Turkey is here taking a very strong and a very important position, and I think we should be taking Turkey very seriously as a NATO ally, because Turkey, so far as I understand, and I feel very humble here because I'm sure that you all know a lot more about Turkey than I do, but Turkey isn't falling as much or at all into the trap of double standards that we see in a lot of NATO countries, where on the one hand we sanction Putin as aggressor and say that he has trespassed international law, but on the other hand we do not dare to say the same to Netanyahu. And I think the biggest threat that we have at the present day is exactly this erosion of international law, where also NATO members, and I do not mean Turkey, because I do not think Turkey is engaging in this, but we also see this in the Netherlands. And we see parliamentarians are disagreeing about it, but where there's a reluctance to take a strong stance against Israel, whereas I think the current government in Israel is reaching international law, not only on the Gaza Strip, but also in the past couple of days in Iran, where currently, the US is supporting Israel or even taking it, accelerating in an attack on Iran that, according to international law, I think one cannot justify, not even in terms of a preemptive strike, since Iran was not right now on the point of waging war with Israel. And I think these double standards, which are also now a real issue in NATO, is something that we have to talk about. And I realize it's a sensitive issue, but I think Turkey can play a very important role in this, also as power broker, both in the Middle East, but also in the war in Ukraine. And here I've got a picture from the September 2024 talk of Netanyahu in the United Nations, where a lot of diplomats, non-Western diplomats mainly, rise and walk away during his talk in protest of the, what I think, and according to experts also in Dutch parliament, can now be called the genocide in Gaza. And I realize this is very sensitive territory, but I do think, regardless of how we name the catastrophe that happens there, the double standards that also create a West versus the rest dichotomy in the UN and in international politics is something that we have to address within NATO, because we're also losing our, and with we, obviously I do not mean Turkey, but I mean NATO as a collective actor, it's the threat of losing the credibility on supporting Ukraine, when on the other hand NATO members, or at least the majority of NATO members, give free rein to Netanyahu in the Middle East. So I think this is something that will obviously be addressed over the past couple of days, but I think Ukraine and the Middle East cannot be seen as two separate issues, because if we start cherry picking in international law, and with we, I mean the Netherlands and some other Western European countries. I do not mean Turkey. But if that's the main vein of NATO, then NATO is losing credibility. And that's why as the last point, I mentioned the credibility of Article 1 and 5. Of course, we always talk about Article 5 and mutual defense. And of course, it's a major problem that the American president, who of course is the de facto leader of NATO, has said things like, we may not protect countries that do not pay enough towards defense, or has talked about annexing Greenland or Canada or whatever. So the credibility of undermining the credibility of Article 5 is of course a major issue that I think has to be, and a major threat that has to be addressed over the next couple of days. But something that is mentioned much less is Article 1, which I want to have a quick look at, which I'm sure all of you know, but where it says the parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means, in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. I think if we see what's been happening in the Middle East and the way that the actions by the current Israeli government have been condoned by quite a few NATO members except Turkey, I do think that's a major problem for Article 1 and for the credibility of NATO as an alliance as at large. So I hope that will be addressed in the next couple of days also. Then quickly the future opportunities, and I know in a few minutes my 20 minutes are up, so I'll quickly go to the future. I deliberately have a map there of NATO on the left, but also the OSCE on the right, because I think what's very important right now is that the different sort of regional security arrangements, of course, NATO is an alliance and OSCE is more of a sort of security structure. And of course, the OSCE has proved to lack resilience in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I do think we also need the OSCE as the biggest regional security organization that does include Russia, because I think what's also important to NATO is that in future Trump has not got the sort of solo prerogative on talking to Putin as he pleases, but that also other NATO members, and I'm glad to see the role of Turkey, where a lot of the talks on Ukraine, of course, have taken place, but also that other NATO members become more proactive, because at the end of the day, there will need to be a negotiated solution, and I don't think we can leave that solution just to the phone calls between Trump and Putin. And that's also why I am glad to be here, because I think Turkey, and I know that everyone from Turkey will know, and it's what Turkey is doing, has a very strategic and important role here as power broker in the Ukraine war as well. Now, I very quickly want to discuss some future scenarios for NATO, which I got from a report by the EU called The Future European Security Architecture, Dilemmas for EU Strategic Autonomy, where there are different scenarios, which in a minute I will explain. Looking at the status quo, either an enhanced status quo going to antagonism, also between EU members and America, a disrupted status quo splitting NATO, either by having a European NATO or an EU defense union, or a patchwork construct where there's a sort of European power vacuum, which may or may not lead to a new kind of Helsinki Final Act, thinking of the 1975 Helsinki Final Act, within the CSCE, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the predecessor of the OSCE context, where a new path towards European security, recognizing borders, making human rights part of interstate relations and so on, was trodden. That was 50 years ago, and we've diverged a bit from that path now. But what I want to discuss very quickly, and then I'll conclude my talk, so no worries, it's not going to last too long, is these scenarios, and I found them an interesting starting point. I will interpret them as myself. So in this EU report, it says you could have an EU pillar and a US-led NATO. So you could have the EU countries ganging up together and trying to become a bit more autonomous from the US. I think two countries here are forgotten that are very important. One, of course, is Turkey, and the other one is the UK. So I think the reason I also wanted to discuss it, I sometimes think the dichotomy between the EU and NATO is a dangerous one, because there's sometimes this thought that NATO minus the US is the EU, whereas obviously it isn't. Fortunately, that was mentioned in previous talks also. So I think in NATO, Turkey is going to be very important in remaining a balance, also in terms of what's happening in the Middle East, but also for Ukraine, for example, we will need the UK very much and its defense capabilities. As to the European NATO scenario, an EU pillar and an Anglo-French-led NATO, that's assuming that the US leaves NATO. Well, I do not think the US will leave NATO. I may be proven wrong in a few days, but I think Trump has chosen an American Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who actually as a senator proposed a law to make sure that the American president could only pull the plug out of NATO with a 2/3 majority. I think he would have chosen someone else if he had really intended to leave NATO. So I don't think it's feasible that the US is going to leave NATO. I think it is a challenge that NATO may erode from within, also because of the stance on international law, also by the US itself, as I mentioned. As to the European Defence Union, of course, we see several initiatives that have been already discussed, such as Rearm Europe. I think they will exist next to NATO, but I don't think they are likely to replace NATO. The patchwork, I think that is a danger that we have to avoid, that both NATO and the EU feel as security providers. So what I very much hope for is that countries which are in between, not in the EU but important in NATO, like Turkey, but also like the UK, will also take the initiative in NATO, so that we don't all solely rely on the US, but we can stay together in NATO. Cooperative coexistence, the report says this may be a sort of an ideal future scenario in about 2045. So that's another 20 years where the EU can really contribute to disarmament and stability. I do think in order to have something like cooperative coexistence, we need to think not only of NATO but also of the OSCE, which I briefly mentioned already. And then my final slide. Minilateralism as another opportunity. I'm showing here the coalition of the willing. What I find very interesting there is not only the role of the French and the British, but also the fact that we've got Mark Rutte there as a Secretary General, Ursula of NATO, Ursula von der Leyen from the EU, of course the Turkish Foreign Minister on the right above. I think minilateralism carries a danger in it, namely that it can lead to the patchwork, that with different conflicts we get different sort of mini alliances. But I do think we should, for the future, also be very flexible in thinking about NATO, but also thinking about NATO in relation to other international organizations. And also within NATO, perhaps creating space for several sort of sub-alliances in order to face the challenges we're meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kramp. It was very informative, especially having the historian perspective of what's happening today. And my question would be about your challenges that you mentioned, including populism, authoritarianism, the moral high ground argument and everything. Doesn't it remind you a little bit of 1930s? And most of those that has been taking place today, and some historians are basically drawing that analogies, including trade protectionism, foreign policy isolationism, emergence of far-right movements, and xenophobia in most of the countries. Isn't this creating, and of course now with this defense budget thing, we are talking about the EU defense budget and increasing defense budget, of course it can trigger another set of arms race around the world. Doesn't it remind you 1930s? And do you think, is it a risk of, are there lessons that we learned from 1930s? Or is history repeating itself?
I think there are definitely echoes of the 1930s. So that's also why my second slide was this quote from the British Parliament, where there was this analogy made like, no one had heard of Hitler before. And that's also why I mentioned populism, for example, because it strikes me as a historian that populism and international relations, for example, are often studied as two separate issues, whereas I think they're two parts of the same coin. And for example, it strikes me that a lot of populist governments on the one hand, for example, support the Israeli government, and on the other hand are against migration, whereas if you look what's happening now in Iran, for example, that will create another flow of refugees, which will also affect a lot of European countries. So why am I saying this? I do think that the mix we see right now is a very worrying mix, the populism part, the authoritarianism, and to some extent some countries turning inwards. On the other hand, I do think one great difference with the 1930s, one big difference, of course, is the existence of an alliance such as NATO, which means if you compare, for example, the Netherlands in the 1930s and the Netherlands today, it was a much more inward-looking country then. So I do think the alliance of NATO, but also other international organizations which weren't there 100 years ago, they are crucial in making sure that we don't slide in that direction. So I see echoes, I think they're worrying, but I don't think that immediately means that World War III is on our doorstep, but never, these are hard, these are dangerous claims to make as a historian. I do think we should be aware, we shouldn't be complacent. That's why I mentioned the end of the Cold War and the triumphalism, because I think the triumphalism, especially in Western Europe and the US after the Cold War, has a lot to answer for, to be honest. So I think we should be aware of it, we should treat it sensitively, and we should use the international instruments we have. But what does worry me, what you also mentioned, is the erosion of international law and the cherry picking, where a lot of NATO members find it easier to sanction a breach of international law when a sort of authoritarian non-Western country has breached it than when a former ally has, if you see what I mean. I think if you look at Iran, for example, it's because of the how shall I say it? Because of if you're against the government of Iran, it doesn't mean that what the US is doing now is legal from international terms. But it does seem that this is often the way it is argued, and I think that is, there are a lot of echoes there which we don't even have to go back to the 1930s for. But also Iraq and weapons of mass destruction and so on. And of course there is a nuclear program in Iran, but that's different from saying that it is justified to attack it now. So I see a lot of worrying echoes, not only from the 1930s, but I also see international organizations that weren't there then. And that's why I think this NATO summit and also having discussions like the one we have today are so important.
Also, you mentioned Middle East a couple of times, comparing it to Ukraine in order to explain the double standards. But from the other part of the world, from the Middle East, I think the beginning usually seen as the conflict in Syria. Mm-hmm. How the use of weapons of mass destruction, refugee flow, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and all of that didn't find a very strong response from European countries. And that is considered a little more the beginning of the double standard and moral erosion of the Western values and international institutions.
No, I think you're right. So that's why I said there are a lot of historical parallels that you can make, and you don't even have to go back to the 1930s. I think in the Middle East, and Syria certainly one of them, there have been a lot of double standards around for decades. Yes, I do agree with that.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Mello, stage is yours.
I think I need to. Which one is it?
Yeah, either I think will do.
Does this work?
We see Trump, that's enough.
Okay, I think, yeah. Yes, thank you very much for having me, for inviting me to this. Yeah, I'm the last speaker today. I hope my presentation complements what we just heard from a historical perspective. Lots of things to say about and engage in these debates about the recent presentation. also the economic perspective and EU perspective. I'm going to bore you with some German politics, I apologize for that. But since the Russian aggression against Ukraine, you probably know about this, there have been quite some changes in German foreign and security policy, which also meant that I did quite a bit of research, not so much on the Merz government, which has only been in power since May, but mostly on the one before, led by Olaf Scholz, who coined the phrase Zeitenwende, or a watershed. It's actually quite common in German, so other things have also been called a Zeitenwende, but the Zeitenwende came about 3 days after the Russian attack on Ukraine, February 27, 2022. There was a parliamentary speech that Olaf Scholz gave on a Sunday. It was a special occasion to discuss this, and that's where he put this term, Zeitenwende, in the open and also announced some drastic changes. And since then, foreign policy analysts like myself and others have tackled with the question of what to make sense of this. Is this really a change, or is this continuity in a different package? I think it is change, and I will walk you through some of the changes, but of course there's also some continuity. I will talk not so much about Friedrich Merz, for one thing, because he's been just in power, so he met Donald Trump at the G7 summit and also in Washington. He also made some very controversial statements, which you're probably aware of, so maybe we get into that in the Q&A. But in my slides, I focus mostly on the Scholz government. So I'll talk about the Zeitenwende in German foreign and security policy, about NATO defense spending, also in light of the upcoming 2 days, and about continued military support for Ukraine. So the speech that I already referred to on February 27, 22, was this Zeitenwende speech by Olaf Scholz, and in this speech he announced several major changes, which actually also surprised his own party. So you could really see people being flabbergasted when he mentioned 100 billion euros additionally spent on defense. So the German defense budget has been around the time around 45, now 50 billion, but then announcing that basically twice that is going to be spent additionally was quite astonishing, also in light of decades of debates about spending more on defense and the need to spend more on defense. And I think in this speech, Scholz also said in German that we need ships that can actually sail, we need helicopters that fly, and tanks that can also go somewhere, which may sound like, okay, what's the point? But if you know the German armed forces, then you know what he's talking about, that actually there was a need to invest because much of the hardware that the German armed forces had was not functional, and there was a big problem. So he announced that Germany would spend 100 billion extra, also that the 2% goal of NATO, the Wales Pledge, would be reached finally, which had also been a long, controversially discussed point, but he made this pledge, and this required a constitutional amendment. So that was the first thing, because in Germany there's this debt brake, which basically prevents the government from spending more than it has, above a certain limit. So it needed a constitutional amendment. This happened, and another constitutional amendment happened just this year. I'll go into that a bit later. Weapons deliveries in the context of the war in Ukraine led to a complete policy turnabout. Another issue in German politics has long been controversially discussed. Should Germany, under which conditions should Germany provide weapons to other states, to conflict regions? It's a bit of a ambiguous discussion, because if you look at it historically, there are also many cases where Germany provided weapons to conflict zones. But all of these have always been seen as exceptions. So the official policy and the guidelines do not allow the transferal into conflict zones. And this policy was changed basically and also began to change. So there were new initiatives about how Germany should deal with weapons deliveries in such situations. Scholz also announced that Germany would procure F-35 fighter jets, which came as another surprise. Also that he explicitly said we're going to buy American F-35s, which I thought maybe that's not the smartest thing to do. Might be from a negotiating standpoint to say, okay, we're going to buy aircraft, and now we're up for offers from our friends in the US and our friends in Sweden and France, and I don't know. But he said, we're going to buy F-35. European defense cooperation was emphasized, new Franco-German initiatives and others also. And finally, a big point also that we saw in the recent weeks is Germany's enhanced commitment to the NATO eastern flank, especially Lithuania, where the existing battle group was supposed to be and is now being upgraded to a full brigade of 4,000 soldiers, which is quite extensive when you compare it to the overall size of the Lithuanian armed forces, which I think are something in the range of 28,000 soldiers, 4,000 soldiers from Germany permanently deployed in Lithuania. So these were big changes, to be sure. The term Zeitenwende then got a life of its own, and Scholz also wrote a foreign affairs article where he then tried to elevate that maybe in a strategic move to get away from this Western-centric notion and focus on Western states and try to talk of a global Zeitenwende. So that's what he attempted to do. Also, he acknowledged a multipolar era and wanted to get buy-in from the global south, from a broader constituency of states. I'm not sure to which extent that has actually worked, but that's how I would interpret what he argued for in this Foreign Affairs article. What is also interesting, and I did a bit of analysis of foreign policy roles, and you may be aware of the civilian power role in German foreign policy, which has been quite influential. In these speeches and in this article, we see a new role for Germany emerging. So what is highlighted here is that Scholz mentions that, according to him, Germans are intent on becoming the guarantor of European security that our allies expect us to be. So two things. On the one hand, he acknowledges that Germany strives to do more in security, actually to become the guarantor of European security, quite a bold claim. And he also mentions allied expectations, interestingly. So very much for the German perspective, it's always, what do the other NATO members, what do the other neighboring states expect Germany to do in this situation? And he refers to this quite explicitly. The article then goes on, where he also refers to the international peace architecture and the European peace architecture, which lies in ruins due to the Russian attack. He refers again to the crucial role for Germany in this moment to step up as one of the main providers of security, slightly different phrasing here. And he refers to Germany's new role, which will require a new strategic culture, and the national security strategy that his government will adopt a few months later will reflect this fact. So that was another big talking point. Germany published a national security strategy, NSS, like the US national security strategy, though I think in the German context it's not supposed to be called NSS, but it is a national security strategy. It's actually the first national security strategy that the federal government has passed. So there was quite some excitement in the foreign policy community to see what will they put down in writing. How will this look like? And as a little advertisement, so there's a special issue for those who read German on this national security strategy, which just came out. Interestingly, it's, on the one hand, it's a bit ambiguous that they mention many goals, but then there's no prioritization. And that's, of course, a big problem from a strategic perspective. You should put a hierarchy in there and say what are the most important goals and what are maybe secondary goals. If you don't do that, how are you going to spend the money? What is in there is a clear threat assessment. And this was the first time that was placed in writing, basically, that Russia is the biggest threat to Germany according to the national security strategy. So that was quite a step. This is the document, the National Security Strategy. I think they didn't dare to call it National Security Strategy in the headline, but the subtitle is National Security Strategy. It's called Integrierte Sicherheit für Deutschland, Integrated Security for Germany. That's the emphasis, and you see this assessment of Russia. Today's Russia is for now the most significant threat to peace and security in the Euro-Atlantic area. So I guess there's a cop-out. If Russia changes or if times change, then that may be different. But at this point, when this document was written, that's the interpretation. As I mentioned, it's ambivalent when it comes to a clear listing of priorities. I think that's the biggest biggest negative point that analysts also pointed out with regards to the national security strategy. Let's move ahead to defense spending. This is kind of the well-known pattern that we saw basically for the post-Cold War era. So 1991 through 2021, before the Russian aggression. And we see NATO spending, EU spending, and Germany spending in relation to GDP, so relative defense spending. And we see that at the end of the Cold War, this was around 2.5%, 2.67%, and it dipped down, and it's what you could call the peace dividend of the post-Cold War times, where it then dipped down to something in the range of 1.2%, 1.3% for Germany. Defense spending has risen already since the illegal annexation of Crimea, 2014, but not as dramatically, and it clearly did not meet the 2% goal that NATO members had pledged to spend. So I also wanted to look at the current numbers. So for this presentation, I took the CIPRI data for Turkey, the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, and the US for a bit of a longer timeline, because I think it's also important now when tomorrow in the next few days there's going to be discussions about the 3.5%, 5%, to not just look at the decade of the 1990s when the situation arguably was, maybe it was easier, I'm not sure. I also recall, and this was kind of the opening of the panel, I think every time there was always a crisis and there was always a fear of abandonment from the United States, the future of NATO and these kinds of things. But when we look at the numbers from 1965, this is the first year for which there is data for all of the 5 countries in the CIPRI database. So that's why I started in 1965. And we see that the level is obviously much higher, so around 3.5% for Turkey, around 4%, 4.2%, 4.3% for Germany in 1965. Since then, the numbers have gone down. When you look at Germany and the Netherlands, for instance, they're quite similar actually in terms of the percentage, not the absolute numbers, obviously. And also this peace dividend, which then goes up towards 2020, 2024. So I think this is a bit of relevant context when we now speak about possibly going to 3.5%. It's not like these countries have never spent 3.5%. Actually, they did, but it's a bit longer ago. And of course, the numbers also look different for Turkey, for the UK and the United States, obviously. So let's talk a bit about the constitutional changes, because it was really complicated to implement the 100 billion package. So Scholz announced this, but when he announced this, he actually didn't know that he would get this through Parliament. He couldn't decide on this on his own, but he needed a 2/3 majority in Parliament, so they also needed to convince the other parties, especially the Conservatives who were in the opposition at the time, to vote in favor of this. Because of the debt brake, because of the limitation that Germany would not allow further investment or to take up debts credit to spend on defense. So that's why they came up with this very creative way, which they call Sondervermögen. It sounds very positive in German, a special budget, extra fund or so, but it's basically debt, right? It's just a new form of calling it. Debt, and they had added to Article 87A of the Basic Law, the German Basic Law, which now has this clause about 100 billion, but they have already been spent mostly. So, but that's in there, it stays there, it's part of the constitution now. This money, as I mentioned, has almost completely been spent, which allowed Germany on the one hand to reach the 2% goal just in this year, depending on the counts, it's 2.1% or so. But the question was, what will happen once the 100 billion are invested? What will happen in the future? So it was clear, even before discussions about 3.5%, that Germany needed more time, more money for the defense budget, and probably another special surplus fund. And that's what happened just this year. and maybe you saw this, but the old legislature, which was still the legislature under Olaf Scholz, and before Merz became chancellor, the old legislature voted on this constitutional amendment. So they decided to implement another surplus fund and to actually make defense spending exempt from the debt brake. So this means that now basically Germany legally can take up credit as much as it likes to meet NATO obligations. It doesn't have to worry about the debt brake any longer. So that's quite dramatic. There was talk about 1,000 billion, basically, the whole package. 500 of that go into infrastructure, also climate change related projects, but defense has been enabled. So Germany is able to meet the 3.5, also the 5% goal, if they want to do this in light of NATO goals. What has also been exempt has been what they called assistance for states attacked under violation of international law. That's another clause that has been inserted into the constitution in this amendment. The context here was Ukraine, but of course this is also possible to apply to future other cases. And this means that actually these guns versus butter debates have come to an end because Germany can spend legally as much as it wants on guns and still provide butter. So it's not a trade-off necessarily, social spending against defense spending, because the federal government is now allowed to take up debt in order to do this defense spending or to assist other countries. A bit on the defense spending or the support for Ukraine, but we already saw some slides on this, so we don't have to go into that. Of course, this is from the Kiel project, the Ukraine support tracker, which I think has the most comprehensive data on this. At some point, they decided to distinguish commitment from allocation. Now it's military allocations, which means the numbers are a bit smaller for the European states, including Germany, than when you looked at commitments. Because I think especially for Germany, it was the case that the commitments were quite large, but some of this was promised to be delivered next year, in 2 years, in 3 years, whenever the tanks are ready or the munitions are ready. And that's why the project now distinguishes between allocations and commitments. And allocations are military equipment that has either been delivered or where there's a clear delivery date already available. Okay, this is the data from 2023, also just to highlight the role that Germany played, but also the Netherlands, which we see here in 5th place in the relative share on the left side, but also in the share of EU commitments and military commitments. Obviously, there were quite intense debates about the extent to which some countries did or did not support Ukraine. Germany, or the German Chancellor Scholz, faced a lot of criticism internally for not doing enough. But I think one can criticize the Scholz government for many things and also maybe for being very slow in some of these policies, but not for the overall amount that Germany devoted to supporting Ukraine. So I think there it was very clear that Germany did support Ukraine to a very large extent and is continuing to do so. Speaking about weapons, one of the debates, maybe that's a peculiar German thing, I'm not aware that it has been discussed to this extent in other countries about which weapons to supply Ukraine with. But in Germany, maybe that's because initially it was really very controversial to support Ukraine with weapons in the first place, because initially there was just talk about non-lethal equipment, non-lethal assistance to Ukraine, but then after the Russian invasion, the government quickly changed this and also was willing and announced that it would provide weapons. But then the question came up, what weapons should Germany provide, should the government provide? And there were discussions about howitzers, battle tanks, the Leopard battle tanks especially, and now the discussion has been already for 2 years about the Taurus cruise missiles. And I think, it's all a bit unfortunate. If I could have advised Scholz, then maybe it would have been a very good idea in 2022 to say, we're going to do whatever it takes, or we're going to do whatever we think is right, but we're not going to speak about military weapon systems. I think that may have been would have been a smarter move than to engage in discussions about every little weapon system. And of course, then the press picks it up, and we have discussions about what the French and the British are supporting and sending, and others are not sending, and about the range of Taurus missiles and so forth. And I think it's all a bit weird, because there's hardly any discussion on the Russian side. What is Russia using? Should they use this or that? Or what does it change the character of the war if Putin decides to do this or that? I don't see this in the same extent. But this debate is happening. What is interesting is that during the Scholz government, for 2 years, the opposition always pressed Scholz on doing more in supporting Ukraine, and especially on delivering Taurus weapons and providing Taurus weapons to the Ukrainian government. And one of the leaders of that was Friedrich Merz. So he pushed for this for 2 years, and there have been many motions that all of them failed, but in each of these motions they called the governments on this point. Now, my expectation was that as soon as Merz became chancellor, well, the first thing he would do is probably to deliver Taurus to Ukraine, but it hasn't happened. So I'm a bit at a loss at why it hasn't happened, and he became quite non-communicative, so to speak, about this issue. The latest point was really to say that the new government is not going to talk about weapon systems. I mean, maybe they should have started that, the previous government, but that's the point right now, and as far as I know, there have been no initiatives to provide Taurus to Ukraine at this point. Okay. Political contestation of military support is obviously also something to investigate, and I've done this in several articles. In the German case, it's interesting because there is this strong anti-militarist sentiment in the population, sometimes also called pacifism. I'm not sure if pacifism is the right word, but clearly anti-militarism, I think, is quite pronounced. And also you see this in some of the parties. Traditionally in the Greens and the Social Democrats, the Greens have changed their position on these issues, also because they're very much in favor of supporting Ukraine. But you see it especially in the SPD, the Social Democrats still, and just the most recent debate was about an SPD manifesto, which was not authored by the leadership of the Social Democrats, but by some of the former leadership and some not prominent figures right now anymore. The most prominent figure is probably Stegner, who you see right here, foreign policy experts of the Social Democrats. And they argued, or they urged for diplomatic talks with Russia, and they also reject NATO's 3.5% goal and 5% goal, and called them irrational. So that was the position of these SPD party members. It has not reached the government, so to speak. So right now we have a coalition between the Conservatives and the Social Democrats, the SPD. But those in the leadership, Pistorius, the defense minister, also have basically not bought into this, and also said it's not their position, it's not the position of the government. But clearly this criticism is happening. And of course we also had challenges from the left, the far left Linke, the newly formed BSW, Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, you see here at the top on the left side, together with Ali Schwarzer. So that's kind of the background noise always to these debates. Also the far-right AfD. So these groups certainly do not agree on many things, but they agree on not sending weapons to Ukraine, or not sending further weapons to Ukraine. Okay, conclusion. There has been a German foreign policy transformation, so the Zeitenwende has taken place. It also became synonymous with German foreign policy change. Now looking at the next few days, it's clear that the government's announced that it aims to reach the 3.5% goal on GDP, on defense, and also the 1.5% goal on infrastructure by 2035 is now, I think, the official position that was announced among NATO. I think Merz at some point mentioned 2032 already. So that has been acknowledged.
This would amount to about 225 billion euros per year, given the current size of the defense budget. So that's an astronomous figure. Of course, the question is, how will this be spent, on what exactly, on what kind of projects? I think these kinds of discussions will be had. The investments will be financed through the new debts, enabled through the constitutional changes I talked about. So that path is cleared, so to speak, and they will also allow further support for Ukraine, which is taken out of the equation. So there will not be any debates about social spending versus support for Ukraine, because one thing comes from the federal budget and the other comes from new debts, basically, that the Constitution allows for. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mello, I know that we have only a few minutes left, but a quick question about about the Taurus thing. I think it was on Saturday. Putin had this press meeting with several journalists and mentioned that Taurus missiles necessitate Western satellite systems, and in order to operate it, you need the German officers, which would mean the direct declaration of war by Germany to Russia. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure. I'm not the technical expert but I mean the latest information that I have is that it would not be necessary to have these German soldiers be directly involved in this. Personally, I also think it's a smokescreen. I mean, it's not a relevant argument. Ukraine has the right to individual self-defense. Other states have the right to aid in collective self-defense against Russian aggression. So this war party discussion, I think it's a kind of argument that Putin is very keen. He knows how the German populace works. He knows the anti-militarist sentiments, and he can throw these arguments into the public debate. And they do the same thing every time. So somebody picks them up, and then there's a discussion, and people become worried and mention Russian nuclear weapons and mention potential war involvement. But then the discussion is, I mean, Putin could do whatever he pleases, and the German populace would have no influence on this, or the German government. So why is there a discussion about should Germany provide Ukraine in its self-defense with this kind of weapon or that kind of weapon? Is there also a discussion about is Putin allowed to use these weapons against civilian infrastructure? Why is he continuing to bomb hospitals and civilian infrastructure and non-military targets? Why is this continuing to happen? So I think this is a ridiculous debate, and it's also.
Do you think Mer's government will not be influenced by this?
I think the Merz government. Maybe, so the question is, I don't know why they decided not to provide Taurus. So one suspicion could be it's a coalition government of the Social Democrats and the Conservatives. And of course, we don't know what the discussions have been behind closed doors, whether there have been considerations about not doing this because it might alienate parts of the electorate of the Social Democrats, possibly. Maybe there are other reasons. I think by and large, Merz will either continue the course that Scholz steered, or he may become a bit more assertive. At least that would be what his rhetoric has been before. Now in government, we don't know how this will play out in the long run.
How about the relation with the United States? Because part of especially when it comes to Germany's defense, United States plays a critical role. So do you think these increasing defense budgets would make Trump administration happy because of its contribution to NATO, or because there may be push towards more strategic autonomy or defense autonomy within Germany against United States?
Observers were interested to see how Merz would do when he visited Trump, and most commentators were happy or at least
there wasn't any major.
No, so he made a smart move.
Expectation is low now.
he presented, I think, the birth certificate of Trump's forefather from some German town, and they dug it up and they presented it in gold or something. And this pleased Trump, obviously, so maybe it was a smart move. I'm not sure if I personally like this, but yeah, so...
Don't seem to be liking that.
Okay, well, you're free to interpret this as you like. Yeah, I think, yeah, it's a bit also with Nathan, with the independence, the question. I think on the one hand, the Europeans are willing to spend more on defense and to do more on defense, and thereby also increasing their dependence on the US. Which is a bit, yeah, that's somewhat problematic. I think in an ideal world it would be good to keep the partnership with the US, but also to make it a bit more balanced and to strengthen European capabilities, which I think would be healthy in the long run. Yeah, European broadly conceived, so including Turkey and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mello. And on that note, we are completing our panel here. Thank you very much for our panelists, and thanks for you for your. It was almost 2 hours, but because of the issues to debate today and tomorrow in NATO, this was an interesting conversation. Please join me to congratulate our panelists, and they will be here for your further Q&As around, so you can ask your questions. Thank you very much.